Mrs. S is the debut novel by author Kay Patrick, and it is a book that I hugely related to. It tells the story of a young Australian who moves to England and takes a job at a girls' boarding school. It's a really old-fashioned place, to the point that our protagonist's job is matron, and I don't even know what a matron is. It's a kind of pastoral role that she takes on, where she helps out the other teachers, covers classes, and deals with the kids. It's a very claustrophobic space, and that claustrophobia is heightened by the author's choices when it comes to language and structure. There are no names in this book, apart from Mrs. S. That's the closest we get to a name. Our protagonist is nameless, and every adult character is just described by their job. And even the kids are described as basically a homogeneous lump of little humans called the girls, capital T, capital G. Occasionally there is an individual girl who gets a bit of focus in the story, and she will just be a girl or the girl, again with a capital G, implying that there is this distance between our protagonist and everyone around them. These kids are nameless, faceless, annoying, strange, alien little things to her. And then there's Mrs. S. Mrs. S is the headmaster's wife, and our protagonist becomes obsessed with her very, very quickly in a romantic and sexual way. Our protagonist is a lesbian. However, she is also struggling with her gender identity and trying to understand it better. She emotionally clings to Mrs. S, at first from a distance, admiring her from afar, fantasizing about her, eager to learn more about her, to befriend her and talk to her. She goes home and continues to think about her. We are in her mind as she just obsesses over who Mrs. S is, who she was, what her life is like, what her personality is like. This is a novel of romantic obsession. And over the course of the novel, they will get closer. And the results of that closeness are very, very interesting. But I want to focus here on why I relate so heavily to this book. And there are three main reasons. I'll leave the biggest till last, because it's the one that's going to take the most introspection and kind of shameful admittance from me, so I need to build up to it. We'll start off easy and talk about the fact that I used to be a teacher and I hated it. As I said, our protagonist is working in a school. The kids are strange, horrible, cruel, bullying little things. They're all girls, and they all seem to be pretty mean or at least mischievous. There's not a lot of goodness to be seen there, but there's also not a lot of differentiating between them because they are this homogeneous lump. Our protagonist is very uncomfortable in this space, feeling very, very claustrophobic. We spend a lot of time trapped in her mind, and this is the first thing that I really related to. When I was a teacher, I found the space frightening. As a kid, I hated school. I hated walking into the building. I liked studying, I liked my classes, I liked reading, but I hated the space. I hated all the other kids around me, and I didn't trust the teachers. I felt very alone and isolated. So why in the hell did I become a teacher? Because every time as a teacher I set foot in a school, I felt a little bit nervous, isolated, alien, like this was the wrong choice, like I was wearing clothes that didn't suit me or I didn't feel comfortable in. But instead of clothes, this was an entire world. And schools very much are a microcosm. And I felt trapped and alone. And any moment where I wasn't just crying, I was asking myself, what am I doing here? Why am I doing this? And of course I did eventually quit. And the protagonist in Mrs. S spends a long time not thinking any of those thoughts explicitly, but certainly reacting in a way and behaving in a way that reminded me of the thoughts and feelings I had as a teacher. This idea of alienation, isolation, claustrophobia, seeing everyone around you as a stranger, not being able to relate to the colleagues or the kids. Absolutely. Now, as I said, this is also a novel about sexual identity, sexual fantasies, romantic lust and obsession, and wrestling with one's gender identity. Our protagonist identifies very clearly as a lesbian. She talks early on in the novel about how she loves the word. She loves the way that it sounds, she loves the connotations, she's very comfortable being gay and a lesbian. There are occasional flashbacks to her childhood. We learn a little bit about her relationship to her mother, and again, that was very relatable to me. But our protagonist also wears binders, enjoys presenting in a butch and masculine way, and loves being perceived as more mannish or manly. But they don't have any of the language for this, which makes me assume that this book is probably set in the 80s or 90s. There are cultural references to specific bands and musicians, but there is no reference to anything digital. No phones, no internet. There is no queer-related language apart from the words gay and lesbian. We never see words like queer, transgender, non-binary, gender dysphoria. Any things that are very normal, common parlance in the queer community now are just not mentioned at all, which makes me think that this is set a little bit in the past. But it's not really important, and the fact that it is left ambiguous is part of the charm of the book, to make it seem like it is floating in this ethereal, timeless space, with just enough pop culture references to create a sense of relatability and groundedness. So you've got a character who has no language to express how they feel, and is struggling with their gender identity after already coming to terms with their sexual identity. They know they're a lesbian, but they are also hiding and trying to limit their femininity and seek out masculinity and feel far more comfortable in masculine roles. And again, for obvious reasons, as a trans person, this is something that I hugely related to. Curiously, it had me thinking about how I've had small crises throughout my life when it comes to my sexual identity. Because sexual identity and gender identity converge hugely. They overlap all of the time. They are both key elements of queer culture. That's why it's LGBTQ+. All of these things are intrinsically linked. And I'm sure it's very normal for queer people to have these crises. If you come out as non-binary or transgender, you're going to at least have fleeting thoughts about your sexual identity as well. It must be a very common thing. It certainly happened to me. And here we've got something similar in the protagonist of Mrs. S. Someone who was assigned female at birth, who enjoys women, but is increasingly enjoying masculinity and masculine expression. This is fascinating to me. And again, very, very relatable. I spent the whole novel understanding how this person was feeling, and the fact that their journey of personal identity was a gradual thing that they constantly felt self-conscious about, unwilling to talk about and express and discuss openly. They spend so much time trapped in their own mind, asking themselves questions, second-guessing things, trying to figure out ways to express themselves confidently, and they clearly have some social anxiety. Again, all of this very relatable, not just to me, but to queer people everywhere. And then there's the third thing, the big thing, which is a kind of codependency / reverse savior complex. Our protagonist, from the very beginning, obsesses over Mrs. S, and it's clearly not just a romantic and sexual attraction, but also a sense that Mrs. S could be the answer to their prayers. In two different ways, I guess. One is if their fantasies came true and they were able to be with Mrs. S. Mrs. S is a strong and confident and experienced woman that our protagonist clearly respects and finds alluring. And so perhaps being with her would make life better, would make life good, would make a confused, doubtful, insecure person feel the reverse of all of those things. Being with someone can give you confidence, especially being with someone who is themselves confident. And then the other reason for this obsession is the fantasy itself. Rather than what the fantasy might lead to potentially, it's more just having something to obsess over. Kind of like having a hobby. You know, when you get into a new hobby, maybe a new video game or a craft or a sport, and it's all you want to do, and it's a thing to focus on, to fixate on, to improve at as you go, and it just gives meaning and purpose to your everyday life. That's kind of what Mrs. S is to our protagonist. A thing to fixate on. Our protagonist can spend time alone fantasizing, dreaming, wondering. Who is Mrs. S? What was her childhood like? Is her marriage okay? I kinda hope not. Fantasizing about what it might be like to talk to her, to touch her, to kiss her. And over the course of the novel, they do get to talk and get closer and become friends. But the fantasy gets to remain because there's always further it could go, there's always more to wonder, more to learn. And instead of just learning those things, our protagonist also gets to fantasize. And that fantasy can be a hobby in and of itself. The reason I related to this is because I have definitely been a very codependent person in the past. Someone who, whenever they feel lost or confused or depressed, will turn to a partner or start dating someone in the hope that they will kind of fix me, that they will guide me out of this fog that I'm stuck in. I don't know what to do with my life. Maybe this person does, and they can take me somewhere. They can show me happiness. They can instill confidence in me. They can give me ideas and advice. They can provide me with company and companionship. They can be my personality. A lot of people define themselves by being part of a relationship. And our protagonist really does lack a personality. And she gets to hope that perhaps the fantasy of getting closer to and having a relationship with Mrs. S will provide them with security. And that security will create a personality. This is a book of self-discovery via obsession. And that's really, really cool. And I'm sure I'm not the only person who can relate to the idea of codependency and another person in your life coming in to kind of fix you, save you, instill you with confidence. I've done it in the past. And now, in my 30s, I'm at a point where I really don't want to do that or be that person. I want to be secure in myself, know who I am, know what I am, and get on with my fucking life. But it can take a long time to get there. A lot of experience, a lot of screw-ups, a lot of missteps, a lot of wasted time. But I guess none of it's wasted if it gets you where you need to be. And that's what we have here. Self-discovery via obsession. I was absolutely fascinated and captivated by Mrs. S. But just before I go, there's one thing I should mention, which is the structure. This book is written in a way that might be really inaccessible to some people. It might really turn a lot of people off, so it's worth just mentioning here. There is a stream of consciousness style to the writing. It's written in the first person, and it can be really difficult to tell when the thoughts and feelings of the character end and the actions begin, and even the difference between dialogue and narration. Authors like Cormac McCarthy, rest in peace, and Sally Rooney have done this in the past, where there is a minimalism to the punctuation and to the written structure of the novel. Both of those authors forego speech marks. I like it. I like the fluidity that it creates, even if it's subtle, even if it's not real. I like it. But for both of those authors and others who've done the same thing, whenever a new character starts talking, there is a new paragraph. There's no speech marks, but we do start a new paragraph. That doesn't even happen here. You'll have a massive block of text, one huge paragraph that covers a whole page, and within that, you'll have lots and lots of narration, internal monologuing, and 2 or more people all talking at once. And it can be really hard to figure out who's talking and what's going on. This is done on purpose, obviously, and it feels emblematic of the character's current mental state. It is all done to reinforce how the character feels. The claustrophobia, the confusion, the social anxiety. It's all very, very smartly done, but it is a writing style that might give some people a headache and turn them off a little bit. So you've been warned. I personally saw the benefit of it, and I thought it served to enhance our relationship to the protagonist and how they feel at all times. The fact that their personality, their confusion, their dysphoria, all blends into the format of the text itself. Very clever stuff, very powerful, but probably not to everyone's taste. If I've intrigued you, please check out Mrs. S. It is a fantastic piece of lustful, sapphic, lesbian, gender dysphoric goodness. Now it's time for my Patreon book recommendation of the week. This recommendation comes from Hannah, who recommends Letter to My Daughter by Maya Angelou. A loving book by a loving writer. Angelou had a son, but she never birthed or adopted a daughter, so she wrote this book to anyone who needed a mother's guidance. This swift collection of stories includes some horrifying and wondrous experiences that beget lessons. She also took time to share great poetry and deep humor. Most of all, there is song. a soul message to the reader that you are not alone. As someone who has longed for a mother's spirit throughout my life, this book exalted me. I learned a lot about respecting other strangers, about independence from those you love, about calling out BS when violence is trying to be justified. Each story you read makes you listen, not only to hear how it will be resolved, but to have you stop and think about essential encounters along the way. Parenting children, a life of singing, surviving assault, the importance of having table manners, getting a job, defying stereotypes, why and when smiling is needed, fighting for civil rights, and mostly how to deal with life, whether you will be changing it or adapting to it. Though she is sharing her life's tales, Angelou is full of admiration and patience for her readers, her daughters, in all their various bodies, minds, orientations, and souls. An incredible offering, but nothing less could have been expected from Ms. Angelou. What an incredible recommendation. Thank you so much, Hannah. If you want to recommend me books like Hannah just did, you can join my Patreon and I'll read out your recommendations, which I really, really enjoy doing. So go and support me on Patreon at patreon.com/booksandbow if you are able to. Check out this book and subscribe for books.